On the morning of Christmas Eve, 1971, the airport in Lima, Peru, was a scene of chaotic desperation. Hundreds of travelers were frantically trying to secure flights home for the holidays, their frustration amplified by the fact that flights across the country had been grounded for days due to severe weather. Among the anxious crowd were 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke and her mother Maria. They had been trying to get back to Panguana, a remote biological research station deep in the Amazon rainforest, where Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm, was waiting for them to celebrate Christmas. Juliane had just graduated from high school the day before. Her mother had originally wanted to fly out earlier, but Juliane had pleaded to stay in Lima for her graduation dance. Now, they were paying the price, stuck in the crowded terminal, begging for any available seats on a flight to the frontier city of Pucallpa. Finally, their luck seemed to turn. They managed to secure 2 tickets on Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A., commonly known as LANSA. It was a domestic airline with a notoriously poor reputation. In fact, LANSA had already suffered 2 major fatal plane crashes in the previous 5 years, and Juliane's father had specifically warned his family never to fly with them. But the desire to be together for Christmas overpowered their caution. They boarded LANSA Flight 508, a Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop, taking seats in the second-to-last row of the aircraft. The flight was scheduled to take about an hour. The first 25 minutes were perfectly routine. The plane climbed smoothly over the snow-capped peaks of the Andes Mountains, the passengers relaxing and settling in for the short hop down into the Amazon basin. Juliane sat in the window seat, watching the majestic landscape below, while her mother sat beside her. The cabin was completely full, with 92 people on board, including the crew. As the aircraft crossed the mountains and began its descent toward the jungle, the bright morning sky abruptly vanished. A massive, pitch-black storm system loomed directly in their flight path. It was a violent tropical thunderstorm, boiling with dark, heavy clouds and flashing with internal lightning. Standard aviation protocol would dictate flying around such a massive weather front or diverting to another airport. But the crew, likely feeling the pressure of being heavily delayed on Christmas Eve, made the fatal decision to fly directly into the heart of the storm. The moment the plane penetrated the dark clouds, daylight was entirely extinguished. The cabin was plunged into a terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the constant, blinding flashes of lightning that surrounded the aircraft. The turbulence was instantaneous and catastrophic. The plane was violently tossed up and down by massive updrafts and downdrafts. Luggage, wrapped Christmas presents, and loose items burst from the overhead compartments, raining down on the terrified passengers. People began to scream and cry out in panic. Beside Juliane, her mother gripped her hand tightly, her knuckles turning white. Then, looking out the window, Juliane saw something that would be burned into her memory forever. A massive bolt of lightning struck the right wing of the airplane, directly hitting the fuel tank. The wing instantly erupted in blinding, brilliant fire. Her mother, seeing the flames, spoke her final words in a calm, resigned voice. She said, "That is the end. It's all over." The structural integrity of the aircraft failed almost immediately. The extreme aerodynamic stress of the storm, combined with the explosion of the fuel tank, caused the Lockheed Electra to literally break apart in midair at an altitude of 10,000 feet. The roar of the engines and the screams of the passengers were suddenly replaced by the deafening, roaring sound of hurricane-force wind. Juliane was suddenly outside the plane. The fuselage had torn open, and she was violently ejected into the open sky, still strapped to her row of 3 seats. She was spinning wildly, tumbling head over heels through the freezing, violent storm. She remembered seeing the dark, dense canopy of the Amazon rainforest spinning dizzily below her, rushing up to meet her like a solid wall of green. And then, everything went completely black. When Juliane finally regained consciousness, the roaring wind was gone. It had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic drumming of heavy rain hitting large leaves and the croaking of jungle frogs. She was lying on the wet ground, looking up at the dense, towering canopy of the Amazon. It was the morning of Christmas Day. She had survived a free fall of nearly 2 miles from the sky. To this day, experts are not entirely sure how she survived the impact. The leading theory is that the row of 3 seats she was strapped to acted like a makeshift parachute, catching the violent updrafts of the thunderstorm and slowing her descent. As she neared the ground, the dense, interwoven branches and vines of the jungle canopy likely acted as a series of nets, breaking her fall in stages before she finally hit the soft, mud-soaked forest floor. Despite the miraculous nature of her survival, Juliane was in terrible condition. She had a severe concussion, a broken collarbone, a deep gash on her right arm, and a swollen, bruised right eye that was swollen completely shut. She had lost her glasses, which was a severe handicap given her strong nearsightedness. She was wearing only a sleeveless cotton mini dress, and had lost one of her sandals in the fall. She had no survival gear, no map, and no knife. For the first day, she was completely paralyzed by the concussion and the overwhelming shock of the event. She drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to even stand up. When she finally gathered the strength to unbuckle herself from the crushed seats and stand, her first instinct was to call out for her mother. She screamed her mother's name into the dense, green void of the jungle, but the only response was the chatter of monkeys and the screeching of tropical birds. She was utterly alone. Juliane was not, however, completely helpless. Having grown up the daughter of 2 prominent biologists who ran a research station in the Amazon, she possessed an incredible wealth of practical knowledge about the rainforest. She knew that the jungle was not a welcoming place. It was an indifferent, hostile environment where the unwary died quickly. She knew the dangers of venomous spiders, deadly snakes hidden in the leaf litter, and the poisonous stingrays that rested in the shallow waters. Searching the immediate area around her crash site, she found a single, small bag of hard candies that had fallen from the wreckage. It was the only food she had. She also remembered the most important piece of survival advice her father had ever given her. He had told her that if she was ever lost in the jungle, she must find a small stream of water and follow it downstream. A small stream will eventually flow into a larger stream, and a larger stream will eventually flow into a river. And where there is a large river, there will eventually be people. Armed with a bag of candy and her father's wisdom, 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke began to walk. Finding a small trickle of water from the recent rains, she began to follow it. Because she had lost one sandal, she used her remaining shoe to test the ground and the water ahead of her, carefully probing the mud to avoid stepping on venomous stingrays or camouflaged snakes. The heat and humidity were oppressive, wrapping around her like a wet blanket. The mosquitoes and biting flies were relentless, swarming her exposed skin, attacking her deep cuts, and tormenting her endlessly. By the 4th day, the small trickle of water had widened into a larger, waist-deep creek. The bag of candy was completely gone. She was now running entirely on adrenaline and the reserves of her own body. The jungle offered plenty of plant life, but Juliane knew better than to eat anything she couldn't positively identify. The rainforest is filled with flora that looks appetizing but is lethally toxic. She drank the murky water from the stream to keep her stomach full and to fight off the severe dehydration, but she consumed absolutely 0 calories. Throughout her agonizing trek, she could hear the faint buzzing sound of search and rescue planes flying high above the canopy. The Peruvian government had launched a massive search effort for Flight 508, but the dense, unbroken roof of the jungle made it completely impossible for the pilots to see the wreckage, let alone a single teenage girl wading through a creek. Juliane tried to look for clearings where she could wave her bright dress, but the canopy was too thick. After several days, the distant sound of the airplane engines faded away entirely. The search had been called off. The authorities had concluded that no one could have survived the mid-air disintegration of the aircraft. Juliane realized with chilling clarity that no one was coming for her. She had to save herself. The physical toll of the journey was rapidly breaking her body down. The deep gash on her right arm had become heavily infected. The relentless jungle flies had landed on her open wound and laid their eggs deep inside her flesh. The eggs had hatched into maggots, which were now eating a hole into her arm. The pain was excruciating, and the psychological horror of feeling parasites moving beneath her skin was almost enough to break her mind. She tried to pick them out with her fingers, but they were burrowed too deeply into the muscle tissue. On the 9th day, Juliane stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Washed up on the muddy bank of the river, she found a section of the airplane's fuselage. Strapped into a row of seats were the bodies of 3 passengers. They had crashed headfirst into the ground, and the impact had been unsurvivable. The sight sent a wave of profound despair crashing over her. Up until that moment, she had held on to the desperate, irrational hope that perhaps her mother or other passengers were wandering the jungle just like she was. Seeing the victims forced her to confront the grim reality of the disaster. She approached the bodies, hoping to find food or supplies, but there was nothing. The next day, her 10th day in the jungle, she could barely stand. She was hallucinating from starvation, fever, and extreme exhaustion. She was wading through a much wider section of the river, letting the current do most of the work of carrying her forward. As she drifted around a bend in the river, she saw something that made her heart stop. It was a small wooden boat moored to the muddy bank. At first, she was absolutely convinced it was a mirage, a cruel trick played by her dying brain. But as she slowly waded closer, the boat remained solid. She dragged her battered, exhausted body up the steep, muddy embankment. Near the boat, slightly hidden by the dense foliage, was a small, open-sided shelter with a palm leaf roof. It was a temporary camp used by local loggers. There was no one there, but under the shelter, she found an outboard motor and a small plastic container of gasoline. Juliane remembered another piece of medical knowledge her father had taught her. Years ago, the family dog had suffered a severe maggot infestation, and her father had poured kerosene into the wound to drive the parasites out. Knowing she had to stop the infection before it caused sepsis, Juliane took the container of gasoline, uncapped it, and poured the caustic fuel directly into the deep, open wound on her arm. The pain was blinding. It felt like liquid fire burning through her nerves. But the brutal treatment worked. The gasoline choked the maggots, forcing them to the surface of her skin to seek air. Suppressing her revulsion, Juliane used her fingers to pull over 30 large maggots out of her own flesh. Exhausted by the agonizing procedure and completely drained of all energy, she crawled onto the dirt floor of the shelter, curled into a ball, and fell into a deep, feverish sleep. She planned to steal the boat the next morning and navigate further down the river. The next morning was her 11th day in the Amazon. As she lay on the floor of the hut, too weak to move, she heard a sound that she had not heard in almost 2 weeks. It was the sound of human voices. 3 local lumberjacks emerged from the jungle, walking toward their camp. When they saw Juliane, they froze in absolute terror. In the local mythology of the region, there is a legend of a blonde, pale-skinned water spirit called the Yemenja, a ghost that haunts the rivers and lures men to their deaths. Seeing a blonde, emaciated, blood-covered girl with severely bloodshot eyes lying in their camp, the men initially believed they were looking at a demon. Mustering the absolute last remnants of her strength, Juliane spoke to them in fluent Spanish. She told them her name, and she told them she was a passenger from the LANSA airplane that had crashed in the storm 11 days ago. The men were stunned. They had heard the radio broadcasts about the missing plane, but they knew the search had been abandoned. They quickly sprang into action. They gently washed her wounds, gave her a small amount of food and sugar water, and carefully loaded her into their wooden boat. They navigated the river for several hours until they reached a local lumber station in the Tornavista district, where a small medical dispensary was located. From there, a local pilot flew her in a small bush plane to the city of Pucallpa. When Juliane arrived at the hospital in Pucallpa, the news of her survival spread like wildfire. But the most powerful moment came a few hours later, when the door to her hospital room opened. Standing in the doorway was her father, Hans Wilhelm. He had spent the last 11 days living in a waking nightmare, believing his entire family had been wiped out. When he saw his daughter lying in the hospital bed, the two of them simply stared at each other, entirely unable to speak. They embraced, weeping silently, communicating everything they needed to say without a single word. Juliane's incredible survival provided the exact coordinates of her flight path, which allowed the authorities to finally locate the wreckage of Flight 508. Rescue teams hacked their way through the dense jungle to reach the crash site. When they arrived, they discovered a tragic, heartbreaking reality. Juliane had not been the only person to survive the initial fall from the sky. The investigators found evidence that up to 14 other passengers, including Juliane's mother, Mariah, had survived the mid-air breakup and the subsequent fall into the canopy. However, unlike Juliane, they had all suffered severe, immobilizing injuries, broken legs, shattered pelvises, and spinal trauma. Unable to move, find water, or seek help, they had all perished in the days following the crash, succumbing to exposure, shock, and their injuries while waiting for a rescue that never came. Maria Koepcke had survived for several days on the jungle floor before finally passing away. Juliane was the sole survivor of LANSA Flight 508. Out of 92 people on board, she was the only one to walk out of the Amazon alive. The profound survivor's guilt haunted Juliane for many years. She constantly asked herself why she was the only one spared, and the memory of her mother's final moments stayed with her every single day. But rather than letting the trauma destroy her, she channeled her experience into her life's work. She moved to Germany, recovered from her physical injuries, and pursued a degree in biology, following directly in the footsteps of her parents. She eventually earned her doctorate in zoology, specializing in the study of bats. In a remarkable display of courage and resilience, Juliane returned to the Peruvian Amazon. She went back to the very jungle that had taken her mother and nearly claimed her own life. She took over the administration of the Panguana research station that her parents had founded. Under her dedicated leadership, she successfully campaigned the Peruvian government to officially declare the area around the station as a protected nature reserve, ensuring that the vast, vibrant ecosystem would be preserved from logging and destruction. The story of Juliane Koepcke remains one of the most astonishing chronicles of human survival in recorded history. It is a story that defies all statistical probability and aeronautical logic. A 17-year-old girl fell 2 miles out of the sky into the most unforgiving wilderness on the planet, wearing nothing but a party dress and a single shoe. Through a combination of miraculous luck, the practical knowledge instilled by her father, and an unbreakable, fierce will to live, she conquered the Amazon rainforest. She emerged from the green darkness not as a victim, but as a testament to the incredible, enduring strength of the human spirit.